Hello, Yakri here with another Warframe video. So this is my third attempt trying to make a video on the Saryn 3.5 Re-Re-Re-Rework. So wish me luck. I keep making it way too long, and I think 30 minutes isn't really like a digestible amount of time to listen to someone talk about one specific change, a change to one Warframe ability. All right, let's just jump into this and see how I do. So there are four really significant changes, right? Saryn's DPS has been reduced significantly in this patch, and her stacks of damage decay instead of dropping off all at once. And now you have no more burst on your one. There's no spore popping ability. Instead, your spores can be recast, whether your stacks are currently decaying, which is the state they go into if no enemies are infected, or even if enemies are already infected, if you want to just spread it to a new enemy in front of you and shoot that guy. And there's no more spread when enemies die from spore ticks. Now, they still spread when enemies die, if your allies kill them or you kill them, but if your spores themselves kill an enemy, there's just no spread on death. Okay? So, as part of that change, they also increased the range of spread on death from sources other than spores to 16 meters from 8 meters. Now, there's some weirdness in the patch notes with that, but that was something that they added in 2015, in September or November? In November, I think. They added that in at the request of the community because, everyone felt it was really clunky that she couldn't spread spores. Spores didn't spread when enemies died from your spores, and when they added that in, I really like the change, and I really don't like that they've taken it out, largely because it's very in theme for Saryn, that you are like this, you're a plague, and you're spreading your spores across all enemies, and I don't know, it felt very good. It was a really good quality of life improvement, and I think it's a big quality of life decrease to have it removed. But I can kind of understand why they did it. Now, we'll talk about that in more detail later, but those are the four main takeaways from this, right? You can build up damage over time by respreading to enemies, and you don't lose all of your damage all at once if you run out of infected enemies. So that's just kind of how she works now, and your spread is going to be long. You're going to have a longer range spread if you're instantly killing enemies with weapons. So that's a good buff to sniper rifles, shooting enemies with Tigress Prime, that kind of thing. That's kind of nice. And oh yeah, her damage. When I say DPS decrease, what has happened is that your damage gain per enemy, right? The amount of damage you gain, stacks of damage you gain, is massively reduced. It's not per enemy reduced. It's rather the number of enemies you can have contributing to your damage stacks is reduced. So previously you could have 20 enemies or 30 enemies contributing to your damage stacks. Now this is pretty common in Elite Sanctuary Onslaught. It's also pretty common in levels like Hydron, in areas, just any area with high enemy density. Like say you've got like a Sortie 3 defense mission with Eximus Stronghold or some modifier that just tends to make enemies kind of tanky, and it's a sort of a tile set that's going to have high enemy density anyway on a sortie, or a Void Fissure with a similar tile set, right? Because Void Fissure spawns in extra enemies. The enemy density is going to be pretty good. You'll easily get over 20 enemies infected. Now, so at 20 enemies infected, you're going to get 60 stacks of damage per second. And at 30 enemies infected, which happened, this is a little bit less common, but on some of the nastier missions out there, you're going to be getting, 30 plus enemies infected. And so that's going to be like 30 plus enemies infected. That means like 90 damage per second gain. Now, currently, you can only infect 10 enemies for the purposes of increasing your damage. So you can infect as many enemies as you want, but only 10 count for boosting your damage. So that's going to be 20 damage per second increase. With 200% power strength, you can get that up to 40 damage per second increase, which is a lot more respectable. But previously, you didn't even need power strength in order to get the 60 to 90 damage per second increase, right? Yeah. The damage increase is pretty significant. It's around 40 to 50% damage decrease in a lot of situations. Of course, if you're running in a mission with very light enemy density and you only can infect 7 dudes, this is probably a damage increase or kind of like a neutral change depending on your build. I found that actually getting to 100% power strength is pretty hard now because of something else I want to talk about, which is her modding requirements are pretty harsh now. because she needs range really badly, she needs duration really badly, and she needs power strength really badly, and she's also very energy hungry, which means dropping prime flow, which you kind of have to do, as well as dropping your efficiency down below 100%, hurts pretty badly. So that's kind of rough. And yeah, so I haven't actually used any builds with 200% power strength myself. But if you get the best, I feel like the most reasonable scenario, or like the most reasonable upper end of power strength that you should be using on Saryn is about 200%, because then you can get that 100% status chance and that 40% damage gain, which is where it's a little bit less severe. It's closer to like 30% damage loss. But a lot of the time, 30% damage loss, you know, talking about easier missions than Sanctuary Onslaught, right? So in Sanctuary Onslaught, it's a much closer to a 50% damage loss there. And that's where this change is targeted at Sanctuary Onslaught, in my opinion. A lot of people are saying that the no spread when enemies die from spores is targeted at Sanctuary Onslaught. I don't think that's correct. I don't think it has a big impact on Sanctuary Onslaught at all. However, the damage decrease has a significant impact. I found myself getting closer to about 2,000 damage is where I was kind of capping out in Sanctuary Onslaught, a little bit over 2,000, you know, but below 3,000. And previously I'd been getting like 5,000 damage in Sanctuary Onslaught in terms of stacks. So in practice, it's a pretty severe penalty. And in particular, losing your stacks now is much more painful because your rate of growth is much slower. So if you, say, actually die, and that'll cause you to lose all your stacks, and going through the gates in Sanctuary Onslaught makes you lose roughly 90%-ish of your damage that you've built up. And that is pretty bad with the new reduced rate of growth. As you know, previously you would lose all of your damage, it wasn't that bad, honestly. Losing all your damage, you could just build up to 5k, no problem. Now, it's a little bit harsher. So, yeah, those are the main points. You could probably just drop this video right now, and you know pretty much everything. However, I want to harp on a little bit more about the damage decrease. So I've already talked about most of the more important parts of this damage decrease. But the big thing here is that the decay rate is so harsh that you can't really, like I mentioned with Sanctuary Onslaught already, you're pretty much having all of your damage drained as you progress through waves. So you can't have this situation where, like, all right, her damage is much lower now, she's gonna build up damage more slowly. But don't worry about it, because as you advance in Sanctuary Onslaught and you get to those higher waves where things are really difficult, if you play well, you'll have built up a lot of damage stacks, and you'll still be doing that high damage that you did before. It's just harder to achieve, and it's not like an instant thing that you get in earlier waves, so you can't really cheese it as easily. And if you die, of course, you lose all your stacks, so you do have to play well and not get killed. And eventually you are going to get killed, and it's going to, like, you know, cause her to fall off, and she won't be effective in Sanctuary Onslaught anymore, and you'll fail out. Now, that doesn't really happen, though, because you lose pretty much all of your stacks going through zones, just from the zone decay. And the other thing is that you can potentially fairly easily have all of your stacks drop off of enemies, or be forced to recast spores, hitting you with the reset decay penalty. So you've got that slowing you down as well, in addition to her slower growth rate. And just a few seconds of being in the decaying state can easily mean you lose, like, even with it modded to reduce the amount, you can easily lose like 30 or 40% of your damage. So it's pretty harsh. And so you can't have that scenario where you're slowly building up damage over time. Not in Sanctuary Onslaught, not in most other mission types either. Maybe in survival. In a very high density survival, it might be more viable. But, you know, in defense missions, the gap between waves is too long, and you're going to lose all this spore damage that you've built up, even in pretty high density missions, because the decay rate is quite fast. And if you're waiting like 5 seconds for new enemies to pop up, right, that's 20% initial plus 10 per second. That's 70% damage lost. It's percentage of current, so you're not going to lose quite 70 at actual percent, but you'll lose at least like 50% of your total damage. So it's pretty nasty. And that's the 5 seconds is maybe a little bit on the low end, right? If it's longer, you're going to be in a lot of trouble. Or rather, you just not going to be building damage over time. And of course, when you complete a round and have to, like, you know, go to the next round, that gap there is pretty significant. You're pretty much going to lose all of your damage. Okay, so that's kind of my issue with that. And the issue I have with the no spread on death that we have now when spores actually kill guys is that it feels bad. It's it's more annoying. I think annoyinger is a good way to put it. It's not a real word, but it's I like to use it because, you know, in and of itself, saying annoyinger is annoying, and you know, it's kind of how it feels, right? It feels irksome. It doesn't feel good to have your spores kind of like peter out if you aren't actively spreading them, especially when they spread away from you and enemies are kind of distant and they're infected, and then they're dying over there, and you can't do anything about it. You have to wait for someone to get close to you, which might not happen if they're all dying out where you just spread your spores to. And then you have to actually press your spore button, lose 20% of your current damage, baseline, and then attack that guy to spread spores again. So this is somewhat reasonable, I feel, because they are trying to produce this AFK playstyle, but it doesn't really stop you from playing passively. It doesn't stop you from doing what you should do in tough missions and hide behind a corner and like shoot around it to spread spores. And it's very annoying. So I don't know if we can really just say like, DE, bring back this ability, because they're probably not going to do it. They really are on the warpath, have been for years, about this like passive play shit. But what I would say is, why not have miasma have an interaction with spores, where if you cast miasma, any enemies affected by miasma that die should have spores spread at the 16 meter base range, as if they had been killed by you from some means other than spores, even if the spore tick kills them. So miasma already can kind of do that if you're lucky, and the miasma tick is what gets enemies, but that won't happen in higher tier missions. So just make it a blanket thing where if enemies are affected by your ultimate ability, they spread spores for sure when they die. And this keeps it active. It increases the power cost for playing her, right? Which is a balancing factor. I'm not sure I like it because her power costs are very intense right now, but it's a balancing factor, and it would make her feel a lot better to play, I think, where you have that situation where your spores are spread out pretty far, so you walk towards a group of enemies that are like, you know, 50 meters away, and you've got your maximum range on, and you hit miasma, and now those enemies are going to spread out spores farther and kind of propagate your death wave. And yeah, you know, it also does let her play from behind cover more, but you can kind of already do that right now with the right weapons to sort of, you know, indirect fire enemies. Okay, so what else is there to cover? Her modding, right? So I want to just cover her modding issues really briefly, and we're going to call it good for this part of the video, and I'm going to make a second part in which I do a little bit more demonstration against enemies and talk about builds a little bit more. But really briefly, so this is the build I've been using for ESO in this update. I'm not 100% convinced it's the absolute best build, but it has done me pretty well. I think I've gotten to wave 9, but I might have only gotten to wave 8 so far this time. I'm pretty confident I could get to wave 9. It's just a matter of, you know, being a little bit just the right amount of careful to not die in that last wave. Yeah, so here's the deal. You need power strength as much as you can get your hands on. 118% is, if anything, a little bit low. I might be better served for a build with more ranks in blind rage. And you need range. 235%, again, I feel is, if anything, a bit low. I still have had some spreading issues due to not having enough range in Elite Sanctuary Onslaught, which is more dense than many missions. Yeah, so with this build, and I think that could be fixed by increasing the range. Actually, no, I know it could be fixed by increasing the range because I've done other builds with more range and ditched Prime Continuity instead, and it just doesn't work quite as well. You need that range. You need it because you need to. What's the word I'm looking for here? Actually, it just doesn't spread far enough to hit all enemies in some of those tile sets, and it's very important that you hit all enemies and kill them all, because your DPS is somewhat of a protecting factor to you, and of course you need that efficiency. So then let's talk about the duration, and the duration I'm sacrificing some stuff somewhat for, because like, probably power strength is maybe what I would get instead, get intensify in there, right? So I'm sacrificing some stuff to get more duration. I'm not using transient fortitude in order to get more duration, because it's more common now to run into these situations where briefly your spores are all gone, right? And you're protected from that somewhat by decay. But if you have just the baseline decay, taking like a couple of seconds in order to find an enemy and spread spores to them, and then shoot and spread spores to them to stop that decay, that is brutal if you have just the baseline stats, right? If it's just baseline, that's going to be 20% of your damage lost, and then if it takes you 3 seconds to find an enemy, right, it's going to be another 30% of your damage lost. That's 50% right there. That's 50%. It won't actually be 50% because, you know, current damage, blah, blah. But it's probably like 40-something% lost total, and that can be very damaging to your survivability in high-level Elite Sanctuary Onslaught. So anyway, point here is that she's more demanding to mod for, because previously power strength wasn't as important. Previously duration wasn't as important. Now duration is definitely not a dump stat, and power strength was, you still kind of needed it before, but you need it more now than you used to. And here's the thing, right? So I've got the 65% efficiency. This fucking hurts now, because you sure as shit cannot fit Prime Flow into her builds now. And you couldn't really before either, but you definitely can't now, that she's more demanding in terms of mod slots. And you cast your abilities more now than you did before, mostly her one, right? And so her one ability now takes like 38 energy with this negative efficiency, and you can't really do anything about it. She's just harder to play now because you have less energy available to you to cast her 2, which you need to do to survive. And to cast Toxic Lash, which you probably need to ensure Spore Spread on the weapons you're using. And because you probably want to use a melee weapon to block, because she's not that survivable in high level versus really high level enemies, and you're going to need to block to absorb damage and to carefully get energy from Hunter Adrenaline. So it's a vicious cycle. She needs efficiency, kind of matters to her more now. Duration, range, and strength are all essential to her, and she's just really, really hard to mod. And I think so that with the no spread on when spores kill enemies has severely impacted her quality of life, and she's become just a little bit annoyinger to play as a result. So thank you all for watching. Come back for the next part, and if you like this content, you want to see more like it, please like, comment, and subscribe. I really appreciate it. And that's all for now. Yakri out.